Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this podcast, which is co-hosted by CDPR and IGC. Today's title is Strengthening Female Inheritance Rights in Punjab, Impacts on Marriage Markets and Human Capital. My name is Ingbeen Atif Mirza, and I work as an assistant professor at the Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Sabrin Baig. Dr. Baig holds a PhD in economics from Yale. Her primary area of expertise is development, economic history, political economy, and applied microeconomics. She has worked on projects in these fields in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Ghana, and India. Sabrin has previously served as the chair of the graduate program at the University of Economics. She has also held visiting positions at the Lahore School of Economics, Princeton University, and the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Baig received the Lerner College Outstanding Junior Faculty Scholar Award in 2021 and the Cleaver Fellowship in 2025. Thank you for joining us, Sabrin.
Thank you for having me, Bean. I'm very happy to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about strengthening female access to inheritance to land in Punjab. Digitization and administrative reform by the government of Punjab has increased the possibility of females inheriting land. However, as your paper suggests, this has been accompanied by some unintended consequences. So it's interesting for us readers that your study looks at inheritance. When we look at gender, there are a lot of studies which focus on labor force participation or education, but your study and all of your authors chose to look at inheritance rights. Could you tell us what property ownership represents for kind of the gender gap in Pakistan? Why is it important to also look at inheritance?
Or asset ownership, right? Asset ownership is a direct measure of female wealth or economic well-being. So everything you talked about, the things that we traditionally tend to focus on, like access to education or access to any resources per se that we believe will eventually lead to better economic outcomes for women, labor force participation, voting rights, political representation, access to leadership positions are with the hope that they eventually improve economic outcomes for women. So I think asset ownership directly is a measure of this downstream wealth of females, but can also act as a resource. So it does both things. It tells us it in itself is a measure of empowerment and well-being, and also provides the resources for women to improve access to education, access to labor force, access to credit. Everything is possibly linked to asset ownership. And the main asset that we have in the norms that we operate in is land. And the main way wealth is transferred is through parents passing on their wealth to children. And so it is fundamental to what women own. And inheritance is the main way that wealth is transferred. And therefore, this question is very important.
Right, understood. So could you give us a little bit of background for why this digitization effort came about in the first place? What was it about women's inheritance that led the government of Punjab to want to make this particular change?
And so it was land governance, right? And I'm going to try to argue that land governance is tied to everything, but the starting point is land governance. To simplify land governance, this partnership between the World Bank and the government of Punjab went out to move from a manual system to a digital system. So if for anyone who has not followed it in the news, land records were the system of land governance was basically inherited from the colonial government. So land was the most important thing, continues to be. And the way we managed it was manually, where local officers hold land records, they maintain them, they change them. In the cases of inheritance, they are the ones that make changes to these property titles. Titles were also manual. You had to go to a patwari to basically get a piece of paper and then go up the chain and sort of get that certified, and that was your title. Very few people actually held titles because all of this ownership was enforced quite informally and in a manual way. And so you can imagine it makes it hard. The main one in my other research looks at the land markets aspect of it. You're very unlikely to participate in a land market, in any land market when the titles and property rights are not securely defined, right? If your entire ownership depends on what the Patwari in your village believes, and wants to believe, then you're never going to rent out your land. So it's a big economic barrier. People don't move out of the villages, and development will only happen as, people move from rural areas to urban areas. They go out and get educated, they go and participate in more productive jobs. But you're not doing it because you're quite tied to your land because of weak property rights. And so the rationale is that maybe we can strengthen these property rights by making the system more formal. And the partnership was to take these paper records and convert them into digital records. So the very first step was taking paper records, moving them from Patwari offices to computers, and then also automating all land transactions. And so if you want to buy or sell land or get a title, you go to land service centers that were available in every tehsil, and you do it everything there. So there's two aspects, I think. One is a digitization, and one is an automation of transactions. This automation was tied to biometric verification. And so even for inheritance, the way inheritance even matters in this is because for that process specifically, it's both digitized and automated. And so a female who could typically be excluded because of Parda norms and would not show up at the Patwari office, now has to show up at the service center because inheritance will not be processed. Um, and so these service centers were also more accessible. So it's not a small Patwari office where there are only males. These centers had female officers. They provided specially access to females. And more importantly, you just could not process inheritance without having all the heirs present. So it was tied to the ID card system. And so you have a family tree, and we already know there's legal provision for Sharia shares in inheritance. You probably know this better than me. And so legally, disinheritance is that the de facto arrangement is females should get inheritance and their legalized share in their father's property, but de jure, that's the law. But in practice, we see disinheritance almost in our data only 13% of women ever get land from their fathers, agricultural land. And the way this happened was because the whole system was quite manual and allowed females to get excluded. Now, once it becomes automated, we see that females do get included more. And I think that part was surprising because the reform is not directly mandating any changes in how inheritance is done. It's changing the procedure, but we do see the procedure prohibits family members from leaving the females out. And altogether, we end up seeing more inheritance for the family deaths that happened shortly after the reform in Punjab.
That's very interesting because when you were talking, I was thinking about the process that you're describing sounds like it's a change to make land transfer more efficient. It's not actually a process that was initiated specifically to help women inherit land. This is just like an unexpected perhaps outcome that has resulted by way of kind of making the process more efficient. Well, that's useful, I guess. So tell me, it sounds like from what you're saying that the law existed, like you said, de jure, we have Sharia rights, people should be inheriting automatically, and there were many kind of ways that families adopted to disinherit or exclude their sisters and their daughters from inheritance. So was the issue just one of implementation? Because we see that as a problem in many other laws which are enacted for the protection of women. It is that laws exist on paper, but it doesn't really make a difference in the women's lives. And is this just an example of a law being implemented better? Or is there a problem which is bigger than just implementation of the law?
I think bigger than just the implementation, right? We're operating amongst the norms that we inherited or that have existed. And those norms are quite persistent, right? And so parents are altruistic, they care about their children, including both sons and daughters. However, the norms, what are the norms that I'm talking about? The norms are that old age support is provided by the sons, female leave the parents' household and live in the husband's household. And so the sort of the de facto practice is that wealth is transferred in other ways to females. So the main way of transferring wealth is through dowries and other forms. Females are not productive with land, right? That's also a constraint that's operating in this entire situation. And so what we see is that parents don't prefer to transfer land to females, not because they don't care about them, but that we are operating under norms and incentives and constraints that make it rational for them to transfer wealth in other ways. Um, it's also implementation, right? And so like I described, because um, the process was so manual, and because land is valuable, right? And parents care about their children, but maybe there's conflict among siblings. And so if brothers wanted to exclude, it was quite possible. So they were both implementation constraints, I think, as well as a contextual, the norms and the incentives and constraints that are facing households as to this, yeah, this practice of almost inheritance in terms of agricultural land. And we're only changing a small part of it, right? We're not even changing any legal provision. In fact, this reform in particular does not put into place any new laws. It's a procedural change. But nothing else is changing. None of those norms are changing. We're still living in the same environment where if I have land, I will never be able to get a loan to be able to farm that land, right? So the other constraints are still applying, but we do see changes, right? We change how things happen. We change households' behavior, but there are many other things to think about how this eventually affects downstream outcomes.
Absolutely. Again, another thing that what you were saying was reminding me of was honor killings, right? So you're saying that, siblings will find their sisters from inheriting. And one of the biggest ways that we've historically seen is for homes in rural kind of agricultural areas is honor killing. And honor killing research has shown that it's obviously almost never about the honor. It's about property. And so I suppose that we'll come and talk about norms and what other things have to be done, but I guess it's also just coming through very clearly in what you're saying. So I was looking at your paper, and there were some very surprising outcomes that accompanied the digitization. And could you tell us something about, what those were and how they impacted the inheritance?
So yes, so first, I just want to emphasize how this family allocation of wealth has is part of many other decisions, right? And so, very tied to inheritance is how marriages happen and how parents allocate or share or transfer investments across their children. Um, and so now what you do is you change the way in which they can sort of do that, and maybe you restrict a bit, right? What the ways households allocate their wealth. So first off, we see there's more inheritance. For the families where the father passes away right after the reform, women inherit more land, and they also get to keep it. So that's really just a direct first stage effect. When you make it harder, you give more bargaining power to the females, right? They will have it. And so for the reform, for the deaths that happen shortly after the reform, there is more inheritance for the daughters. Um, but it changes everything else for for those daughters as well. So with the land in hand, we see effects on their marriage outcome. So the daughters that were unmarried or young at the time of their father's death, we see a speeding up of marriage, a speeding up of fertility, and less consent in marriage, and slightly worse marriage outcomes. And so that makes me think, right, that in the status quo, parents were investing in their daughters by giving them dowries, by optimizing their marriage outcome, right? And so matching them well is also an investment in a woman's long-term well-being. When you increase the margin of their land ownership, when you're forced to give them the land, those other margins go in the negative direction. And so if dowries and inheritance are these substitutable investments, when households are forced to increase one, maybe this other margin goes down, and that leads to worse marriage outcome for the daughter. Um, for these women who do inherit more, they also don't have a father, right? And I'll just explain what happens to the women that expect to inherit more in the future. But these women that realize more land transfer, they experience negative effects in terms of other long-term outcomes. It becomes quite apparent that when you think about one thing, these decisions about the marriage are all tied to the decisions about, they're all investment decisions from the point of view of the parents. And when one changes, there is undoubtedly going to be effect on these other margins. And in some cases, we see that it's negative. And this is not just in our context, right? It happens all the time. It has been demonstrated in the case of many other forms, right? It hasn't been introduced. It affects how marriages happen, right? And so now you move on, you move to an environment where you divorce. It changes how people negotiate before they get married. And sometimes, right, you negotiate less transfers to the wife because you know that she has more rights if she chooses to leave the marriage. And so this is a universal thing because these decisions are never in isolation, they all sort of happen simultaneously. Um, we do see that there are positive effects for the girls who expect to inherit more in the future. And so for the girls whose fathers are still alive, but after the reform, they know they're going to have more bargaining power in the future. We see that the fathers delay their marriage, so the opposite effects. They also invest because your marriage is later. It's you get more education because in the Pakistani context, marriage is one for one tied with education, so it's almost perfectly correlated with school dropouts. And so if you get married later, you also stay in school longer. And you have slightly improved marriage outcome in terms of the husband's education and the husband's income. And so there could be these countervailing effects. One is that just in the very short term, there could be substitution in a way that leads to negative effects for the females. But in the long run, as you have time to make these compensatory investments, and as you internalize the changes that the reform is bringing, and more importantly, maybe as norms change, the outcomes can improve. Um, and so, since this is still a work in progress, we're still trying to unpack what is really happening and what mechanisms are applying. But we know both from our work as well as lots of work that has been done in the past in terms of legal changes and other reallocation towards women, just gender reform in general, that there's both these risks of backlash, these short-term changes, and these spillover effects on everything else that you're making decisions about as you're making decisions about allocation of wealth.
That's very interesting. I have a question which might be very obvious, but so in the short term, marriages started happening for younger girls, and in the longer term, you're saying marriages are being delayed. In your study, do you have any sense of why in the short term, suddenly they were starting to get married earlier?
Yeah, so in the by the short term, I mean like ones the women who do get the land because their father has passed away. So for the women whose fathers passed away shortly after. And so it could be what could be the mechanisms, right? One could be that there's differential altruism across the fathers and the brothers. In when the fathers are negotiating for them in the marriage market, their outcomes could be better. Um, when it's the brothers, the outcomes are worse. It could also be this dowry versus land, and maybe dowries are better than land for many reasons, right? The land
Mm.
is not movable, right? The land is harder to exert property rights on for the husband's family. The land is also more illiquid, right? And there's more risk of conflict related to the land. And so if these marriages got faster because girls have land in their hands, it's not valued in the same way in the marriage market, and therefore it does not help them so much if you describe it that way. Um, it could also be that the these women just lost these are young women, right? Who lost their, if you're unmarried and your father passes away, you're obviously young and it's a really negative event that has happened. And therefore there are these possible negative outcomes. Um,
Mm.
for the women who anticipate to inherit more in the future, right? So inheritance has not yet happened in their families. The fathers are still alive, but there is this knowledge that in the future I'm going to have more bargaining power. Those reallocation of investments work in their favor, and parents, we see them getting more education and delayed marriages, which could again reflect the incentives of parents to avoid conflict in the future, to ensure that they have made enough investments in their daughters so that these same negative outcomes don't apply when the fathers do pass away.
Wow, that's very interesting. Thanks. So, another thing that seems to be happening based on your paper is that uh, girls are not getting their CNICs as much. And is that one of the outcomes? And how, could you tell us how that impacts, and what impact is that going to have on this digitization, which is supposed to help women inherit? Now, what's going to happen?
Sure, we do see this marginal effect on CNICs. And so, like I was saying, households are rational economic actors, right, which are operating under their incentives and constraints. In this case, like these did patriarchal norms. And so, if the reform is blocking the traditional pathways of cutting out women from the inheritance, there may be other loopholes, right? And as I explained, the way uh, the way the reform worked in blocking out disinheritance is through the procedure through which heirs are verified. So since that becomes automatic and that's tied to the family tree and the national ID card system, this withholding women from the ID card system is something that will then eventually withhold them also from the inheritance process. So since the system relies on this ID card system and biometric verification linked to the ID databases, that we do see generally the penetration of ID cards is pretty high in Punjab. Almost everyone has them. And we know why, because it's tied to everything, right? To access to credit, to access to a bank account, to higher education institutions, things like that. So it's important to have it, and if that's the loophole that families are adopting to disinherit and to exclude females, then it's a quite a severe trade-off that we need to think about. So the way we can explain that result is that maybe it's another loophole that households are using to exclude females. We see a slightly lower rate of having ID cards amongst the women after the reform. And so again, this is not that's only happening here, right? So historically, also, we know that when things change for women, so in the context of the West, as education became more accessible to women, right, as colleges and universities opened up and women were getting more education, in the very near term, we saw that there were these negative outcomes for them, right? There were these marriage bars and there were regulations that restricted these women who had more education from getting jobs, from getting married, from realizing other positive things for them, because we want to stop what we're trying to achieve. And eventually, right, as the norms change and you move to a new status quo, outcomes are better. And so there's always these near-term trade-offs that we should think very carefully about um, before the longer term norms change and before things adjust to the new environment.
That's very interesting because regulatory bars on women is actually kind of the state being complicit in kind of setting, bars for women to be able to participate. But of course, societies always do respond. And this brings us back to the societal norms that we've been talking about, that it obviously takes time for norms to change, ideally if they do change, but also in the short term, then families start responding differently. And so the CNIC can be a really challenging factor for all types of work relating to women, right? Like, so even in terms of violence and honor killings and domestic violence, etc., if a woman just doesn't exist in the state system, if she's born without, she's born at home, which is still a reality for us, for many people in Pakistan, Punjab, then it's possible that she doesn't have a bay form, and it's possible that she doesn't have a marriage certificate. It's possible that she can live and die, and the state will never know that she existed at all. And so I suppose it's a very good development that the state has made everything dependent on the possession of a CNIC. But of course, it still remains a challenge to actually implement that and get people to, take the step to actually register the presence of their daughters. So these are all slightly unintended consequences of this digitization, which was supposed to have and does have a positive impact on women. What does this tell us about the gender gap from an economic and gender justice perspective? And what do you think it says about these assumptions that we sometimes make about, economic empowerment will automatically lead to better outcomes for women?
Um, so like our findings, I think, put direct, or as well as others, the direct linear relationship is obviously not true, right? Um, good intentions are not enough, firstly, and I tell this to my students, as well as when I'm talking to policymakers. Things don't operate in isolation, and everyone is a rational actor. They are responding to the environment that they are in, and they are making decisions based on the incentives and the constraints that they do face. And so, this linear assumption that when you expand legal economic protections and you shift assets into the women's hand automatically translates into immediate well-being and agency is probably almost always doesn't apply, right? Because there's this fluidity. There are countervailing investments that households are making, right? And so how you want the process, right, through which you hope to get more assets into the women's hands and improve their outcomes is important. And so you give legal rights to women, right? You legalize or you illegalize disinheritance. All those things are good intentions, but they are going to lead to countervailing investments and countervailing decisions. And so that's always something to think about. And then again, another thing to think about is the realized immediate outcomes in the long-term equilibrium. In the most, I think, sensitive part is immediately after the reform when norms have not changed. And let me just point out here how persistent the norms are. And so there's work in anthropology and economics that shows that there's two kinds of societies, right? The sun preferring cultures and then other cultures that are not that. And it doesn't have to do very much with the development, right? And so you look at India, you look at China, they're countries that got very, very rich, but countries that got even better, even worse for women. They're highly sun preferring. And that, where does that come from? That actually comes from historical economic practices, right? And so the areas where sons are very preferred are the areas where agriculture was practiced in a way that women were left out. Agricultural practices were such that men had to participate in agriculture and men were the economic breadwinners and women were not. And this was not always true. In fact, in much of Africa, agriculture was different. Both men and women were able to participate. You didn't need deep plowing of the land. And so many, many hundreds of years ago, norms were established about who does household work and who generates income. And this is true even in the US. The US is an example of an area where agricultural practices favored men. And we are still in a society, right, where those norms persist. So that is really how persistent norms are. It's very hard to move them. You have China, right, where it has all changed. Agriculture, there's no advantage that men and women have. If anything, women are maybe more productive, but the norms continue to favor men. And so it's not that they're impossible to change, but they change very, very, very slowly. So anything that you do is going to operate in that persistent norm environment. And so uh, we can think of many laws that are well intended. I also like to give the example of dowries, right? Dowries are very prevalent in our culture in South Asia. They they are necessary almost, right, to clear the marriage market in order for you to ensure a good groom for your daughter. They are also negative in the sense that they put a lot of pressure on they seem unfair, right? And so you can put a law in place that says they're illegal from now on. Right? And so you can see it's a well-intended law, but it's really unclear. In fact, we see actually very negative outcomes from there in some cases. Because what is this law? This law is just something that is forcing people to do something that is in the status quo based on the incentives and constraints that they face and based on the norms that they operate in. You did not change any of these incentives or constraints or norms, but you changed one isolated thing and you sort of forced a behavior that's not happening naturally. Um, and so, unsurprisingly, right, just changing one aspect is could be well intentioned. It could lead to long-term change, but in the short run, there's lots of things that will respond because incentives, constraints, and norms have not changed. Um, and so I think our work tells us exactly that, right? It tells us that households are not making decisions in isolation, and it tells us the need for thinking about um, either complementary interventions or everything else that we should be thinking about when we have these well-intentioned legal changes or procedural changes in our minds, and that this effect is not linear from changing a law to making everything better. It almost never is. And Veena, I think you're muted.
Oh, thanks. What you said reminded me of this book I recently read. Sarah Milkani, who's a lawyer in Karachi, wrote a book on progressive laws in patriarchal societies, and she picks it's based on kind of four areas: there's rape, child marriage, domestic violence, and honor killing, and all of them kind of identify well-intentioned laws which are received in kind of social and institutional norms which are just unreceptive, and how just a well-intentioned law, like you're saying, exactly your finding well-intentioned law can be well-intentioned, but it's not going to make a difference without the norms changing. And so the backlash that comes to these laws, both institutionally but also socially, is what keeps the laws from actually taking effect. And so just linked to that is something that your brief also emphasizes, which is, like you're saying, a law in isolation isn't going to have impact. So what are some complementary policies or interventions that you guys propose or you're thinking about in your brief, which you think will help shift the social norms along to make this law actually effective?
I think it's always important to insulate girls' human capital. You should be doing that both on its own as well as in combination with anything else that we do. In fact, um, again, when I talk about Pakistan, I just talk about how terrible it is for women. And it's an anomaly in our region, right? It's not, I think, only we lag behind Saudi Arabia and Iran along many margins. And so it's not just culture. And so let me, I guess, tell you some numbers. The bank account penetration for women is like in the 20%, so is labor force participation. These numbers are much lower than regional averages. Um, so it's not just Islam, right? Because we have Bangladesh as well. Um, and so it's almost puzzling to me why we are so slow in changing some of the margins related to women. And so when I talk about anything, even when it's the macroeconomy or its inheritance rights, in the case of Pakistan, almost always insulating girls' human capital. In this case, right, preventing families from using these from like reallocating their investments in leaving women behind in terms of education will hopefully um, protect that. Um, and even if it doesn't, it can't be bad, right? It's almost like killing two birds with one stone. And so if you kill both birds, it's good, but you will always kill one bird. And so targeted scholarships, conditional cash transfers, dedicated school retention stipends for girls are just always a need in our context because we are so behind on that. Um, yeah, but generally too, I do lots of interviews about like how do we get Pakistan to grow? Like why is it not growing? Why are other economies in South Asia growing much faster? If one thing that we lag in terms relative to our neighbors is the gender imbalance. And so anything that allows us to bridge that will help the macroeconomy as well. Protecting marital choice and legal agency in this case, right, is also a good complementary investment because as we see, the way we are countervailing the positive effects is through the marriage market, through the ID card. So protecting those rights is again will help independently, but might also allow the reform to continue to have the positive effects by making it harder for the countervailing forces to apply. And so when you were saying, right, because these ID cards are tied to so many things, it's very hard for anyone to not do it. And so if you make it very hard for anyone to not do it, then you are unlikely to see that as a negative unintended consequence of this reform. Again, yeah, so mandating this legal identification, but also establishing a mechanism for this downstream monitoring of social outcomes. And so again, it all comes from good intentions and they're top down, but the more downstream we can go to see what's happening and to ensure to at just firsthand understanding what is happening downstream will allow us to make sure that we can avoid the negative unintended consequences. So the routine monitoring dashboards, collecting more data on what is happening downstream or what happens at the end of the day. In fact, even for our work, we have yet to learn if you inherit more, right? If you get to keep it, right? Like at the end of the day, does it make women have more wealth? Whatever mechanism that operates at, whether it is through investments in another way or through this direct land transfers. And then, like I said, everything that has happened in history, like the suffrage movement, almost always needed complementary investments and almost always had short-term backlash that you had to deal with somehow in order for it to survive long enough to see the long-term norm changes and long-term positive downstream effects.
Absolutely. And this thing about, whether women are actually going to be able to keep the property they're inheriting. Um, I mean, I'm sure this problem still exists, but we work with judges sometimes, and judges are always very keen to believe that sisters want to forego their inheritance in favor of their brothers, because they'll always come to court and they'll say, I forego this, and when trainers, when we work with them, it's still a task to say to them that you have to probe it further. Why would that happen? And why would you take that at face value? And so there are many ways after after the inheritance has been transferred to stop that transfer, stop it from being actually, implemented. So you're right.
Or
It's
not
just,
doing anything at all. In our data, we see like over half the women saying, like, I don't know what has happened with the land.
yeah.
And yes, you're very right. We see that. And that's so interesting to me that there's just an understanding that that's what everyone is going to want to do. And maybe it's true, right? But it's important to understand why
Right.
and that
Yes,
and why it's not changing organically or like
absolutely.
why the reform is changing or
Or
not
whether
changing.
the assumption is even well-founded to think that, a sister will always want to give it up for her brother. Really, where is that coming from? So just kind of, probing, which, institutions, I suppose, are not always interested to do. But I guess what it is kind of like a trial and error praxis, right? You do something, you observe downstream effects, you go back and you tweak it. And like you're saying, I think it's very effective. What you're saying is to make it so difficult to not do that thing, like the ID card, is what is really actually going to bring about some kind of change.
Yeah, or keep
Um,
girls out of school, right? Like when the harder you make it, I feel like it's always going to help. Um,
Yes, absolutely. So I guess my final question, Sabrine, would be that looking ahead, especially with initiatives like Pulse underway, what are bigger questions that your research opens up for policymakers, for legal scholars, for development practitioners working in the area of gender inheritance?
Yeah, let me quickly introduce Pulse. Pulse is sort of a follow-up program in Punjab to this initial digitization program. It's the Punjab Urban Land Systems Enhancement Project. It's again represents an exciting frontier. It's going to use the same biometric framework and digitize land records to allow co-owners to partition the jointly owned land. And again, the initial intentions are related to land governance, but it's going to affect many more things than just land governance. Females currently own land with their brothers, So even when they do, it's joint ownership. Joint ownership is complicated for many reasons, but beneficial too. So that's again something to learn. This reform particularly will allow these co-owners to partition land and go from joint ownership to solo ownership. I think it opens up vital questions, right?
Mm.
Um, is it good or bad? To me, that's first and foremost. Understanding that is important. How different is joint ownership from solo ownership? And is it beneficial for women to have sole ownership, and how beneficial it is, or along what margins? Um, Again, the intentions are good. The intention is to simplify land governance and land markets and make the land markets more fluid. I was referring to earlier how our land markets are very thick. Almost no one rents out land. In fact, Punjab is highly productive, right? We're not living in a province that has bad land. The land is very good, and we're not realizing the true potential that land has in Punjab. We're not operating farms in the most productive way. We're buying food instead of exporting food. Some of that is the way our land markets operate. Um, I had a PhD advisor who used to say a farmer in America or in Canada would say, "Give me the whole province and I'm going to farm it like one big capitalist enterprise." But we don't have that. We don't have the large farms that are going to be productive and produce at a much more productive in a much more productive way, and become a country that is exporting food instead of importing food. Um, Part of that is these land markets don't work well. And so when you are putting these reforms in place, it's important to understand that when you simplify land governments and possibly simplify land markets, are you also going to have an effect on female ownership, how households are making decisions about female outcomes that are separate from transfer of land, that are related to their marriages, to their education? um, if the social norms are going to change, how long it will take for these social norms to catch up. And again, does this sole title ownership even translate into true economic control, right? And so I can have a title, it's all in my name. What will I do with it, right? If I have no way to, if no one is going to want to rent from me, right? Or if I have no way to manage land, maybe it's not beneficial at all. Uh, are we going to need those improved access to credit, improved access to other complementary inputs in the agricultural market? Um, are we going to need to change the social norms, right? Um, in order for it to be beneficial. If that's the case, then there's a lot more work that we need to do. So answering those fundamental questions is important to understand what this will do. But that's the new initiative that came out from this prior work in the last 10 years or so, which is related to formalizing land governance more broadly in Punjab.
Excellent. So, yeah, I hope it doesn't turn from one form of dependency to another form of dependency. If I can't rely on my brother, I have to rely on my husband. But this has all been very, very informative and interesting for me. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing the final results of your paper eventually.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful chatting with you.
Please subscribe so you never miss a podcast and comment below who you would like to see next.